Prime is defined as a state of greatest strength, vigor, or success. That is a bold assertion to make from a game launching the beloved Metroid franchise into the third dimension for the first time. Over the last 35 years, the Metroid series has gathered notoriety for its unique gameplay, desolate atmosphere, and grandiose worlds. A jump to 3D naturally brings with it sizable changes for any franchise, but today, I would like to explore with you why Metroid's 3D magnum opus is wholeheartedly deserving of the Prime subtitle. In 1994, Super Metroid released to critical acclaim and perfected the genre we know today as Metroidvania. The game created an expansive world and dark atmosphere out of the very limiting specs of the Super Nintendo. Every area is rich with secrets, and the game allows for virtually infinite replays with its permission to sequence break it into oblivion. It still stands today as a masterclass of level design and some of the best use of the Super Nintendo hardware for its time, and I would personally go as far as to call it my favorite game on the system. Just 2 years after the release of Super, the Nintendo 64 was released, which sprung many of Nintendo's major franchises into 3D for the first time ever. Except for one series. Metroid was noticeably absent from the library, perhaps an implication of the difficulty of following up Super Metroid. It would not be until their next console, the GameCube, that we would finally receive the series' long-awaited return. Metroid Prime was released in 2002 for the Nintendo GameCube, developed by Retro Studios as their debut project. This is the Metroid series' first venture into the third dimension. As such, this video will serve as mostly an analysis of how the game evolves the formula and what it does right and wrong. This year, the game turns 20 years old, and with a new installment in the sub-series coming eventually, I found it fitting to cover. Be warned, I will not hold back from discussing every major story and gameplay element in the game, so there are massive spoilers ahead. With that out of the way, let's take a journey throughout the world of Talon 4.
"10 years ago, below the surface of planet Zebes, the mercenaries known as space pirates were defeated by interstellar bounty hunter Samus Aran. Descending to the very core of the pirate stronghold, Samus exterminated the energy-based parasites called Metroids and defeated Mother Brain, the leader of the pirate horde. But the space pirates were far from finished. Several pirate research vessels were orbiting Zebes while Samus fought on the surface below. After the fall of Mother Brain, the ships escaped, with the hopes of finding enough resources to rebuild their forces and take their revenge. After discovering a possible pirate colony on planet Talon 4, Samus has again prepared for war, hoping to end the pirate threat forever.
Samus receives a distress signal from a space vessel orbiting the planet Talon 4. She arrives at a gruesome scene of dead bodies everywhere, creatures on fire, and the architecture collapsing. The game acquaints you with your scan visor very early on, and introduces it as the primary method of gathering information about your surroundings. By doing some optional scanning in this area, you discover that the space pirates have been experimenting with genetically modified organisms. However, you quickly learn that not all of the occupants have died. The music is tense and ominous as you slowly make your way through the cramped hallways, occasionally encountering a threat on your path. While making your way through, you become accustomed to Samus's suit at its high power level. The battle with the Parasite Queen teaches you how to strafe and get quick, powerful shots in small openings with the missiles and charge beam. In typical Metroid fashion, the killing of the Queen transitions into an escape sequence. As you make your way out, you find Ridley perched atop a ceiling. Right before you make your escape, the impact of a blast sets your power suit to its lowest capabilities. Off in the distance, Ridley is flying on a Talon 4, and it's up to you to stop him. Something I love about this opening section is how effortlessly the game acquaints you with its unorthodox control scheme right off the bat. Not having the ability to control the camera with the C-stick in a game in which its combat is designed like a first-person shooter is odd at first. But this is where you realize, the game is not meant to be a true FPS. Despite this, the controls still just feel amazing. It's important to note that there are two different versions of Metroid Prime. The original GameCube release and the Trilogy remaster on Wii, putting the game in widescreen and updating the controls to the controls of Metroid Prime 3, along with a few other tweaks. Most notably adding the spring ball from Prime 3. The spring ball is a nice quality of life feature, but it makes every bomb jumping related puzzle a billion times easier. Take for example the energy tank and Magmore Caverns. In the GameCube version, you have to properly time 2 bomb jumps to launch you up to the ledge, and if you mistime it, the ground beneath you will break, and you'll be stuck in lava for a brief moment. In the Wii version, you can trivialize the bomb jump timing and punishment by using the spring ball. All it takes is a flick of the Wii remote, one tap of A at the height of your jump, and one more flick to launch yourself up to a free energy tank. This is not to say that the addition of the spring ball is a bad inclusion. It's actually quite a bit more convenient to navigate through morph ball sections with it. At the end of the day, it comes down to whether you'd prefer convenience and easier puzzles or challenge. The Wii version also introduces difficulty options: normal mode, veteran mode, and hyper mode. Veteran mode is actually the difficulty that you play on in the GameCube version, and normal mode is an easier version of that. Hyper mode makes you take more damage from enemies, and you also deal less damage. The problem with this mode is that it doesn't really add to the game's difficulty. Instead, it simply artificially extends the length of enemy encounters, thus making it extremely tedious. It's always nice to have options, but I find that veteran mode offers the best all-around experience. While nowhere near as difficult as I would have liked, it doesn't make the game as painfully easy as normal mode or painfully boring as hyper mode. As I previously mentioned, the controls across the two versions differ vastly. The Wii version uses motion aiming, which is independent of your movement, unlike the GameCube version. It makes moving around, exploring new paths, and intense combat way more enjoyable. The downside that comes with the Wii controls is the fact that visors and beams aren't bound to an input on the controller. They must be selected from a menu with the motion controls. This makes it a little more annoying to change visors or beams in the heat of a battle, which happens more often than you may realize. This is where one could argue that the GameCube controllers are superior, since the visors and beams are bound to the D-pad and control stick respectively. The other issue that plagues the Wii controls is how you shoot the super missile. This may not bother everybody, but it does make shooting super missiles consistently a little bit more difficult, at least for me personally. On the GameCube controller, you hold down A to charge your beam, and then tap Y while still holding A. This works perfectly well on that controller because all of the face buttons orbit A. The tip of my thumb is naturally hovering over Y at all times when I'm using the controller. On the Wii remote, you also hold down A to charge your beam, but you have to move your thumb enough to reach the down button on the D-pad. This always felt really awkward to me since I don't have the biggest hands. It's still doable, but I can't blast super missiles as consistently. Overall, I would say that the Wii version still has the superior control scheme. The motion aiming goes a long way to make the experience that much more enjoyable, The GameCube version still has its merits, and is actually still a very fun way to play, but the Wii controls are just a bit more accessible. With all of that being said, the footage in this video will primarily be the Wii version, supplemented by some GameCube footage. I'm actually playing the modded Prime Hack version of the trilogy, which allows for keyboard and mouse support. It's easily the definitive way to experience this game if you have the means. Aiming with the mouse is heavenly, and having designated keys for visors and beams is great too. So that's why the gameplay looks much snappier than that of the Wii Remote and GameCube footage. With that out of the way, let's get started. The surface of Talon 4 is in stark contrast to the Space Pirate frigate. You find yourself in a beautiful rainforest, surrounded with desaturated greens and raindrops landing on your visor. The choir smoothly yet confidently comes in, perfectly complementing the peaceful atmosphere of it all. Metroid Prime was my first Metroid game, so on my first playthrough I wandered for a bit, not entirely sure what to do. I poked around and found the secret missile upgrade. Perhaps this is my way forward. But how do I get it? I did not care that I wasn't instantly making progress. The joy of just experiencing the world I was in was more than enough to keep me engaged. I think this is the thesis of Metroid Prime. It's not about your destination, but rather the memories you make and the experiences you have on the journey. On this journey though, you will put your strength and wits to the test, until you achieve success. The game does a lot to not let the player get discouraged if they aren't progressing immediately. What's great about Metroid is even if you aren't finding the correct pathway forward, you're still collecting useful information about the world around you that you can keep in the back of your mind for when you do have the needed upgrade. It's no different in Prime, but you have even more resources at your disposal, namely the map system. Saying this map setup is great would be selling it short. I would argue it perfected the 3D map. Tap the 1 button on your Wiimote or the Z button on your GameCube controller, and you're greeted with cartographic bliss. The map will show you a 3D model of every room in the region you're in, assuming you've found the map room. If not, then just the areas you've explored. Unexplored areas are blue, and explored are orange. This is a big help when exploring a new part of a world you may be familiar with, and helps to pick up the pace a little bit. When a certain room is highlighted by the player, you can see all of the doors within the room. The doors are color-coded based on their respective beam upgrades: blue, purple, white, and red. The player is represented on the map with an arrow that points in the direction you're facing, which makes figuring out where you need to go a whole lot easier. You can zoom in and out of the map to help make routing paths throughout the world simple, and the C-stick gives you full control over moving and rotating the map. If you happen to get lost in the world, a hint will pop up on the map and show you the exact location of your next objective, and show a little text box about what you'll be doing. What's nice about the hint system here is that the game tells you what room you need to be in, but never how to get there. It simply serves as a reference to point new players in the right direction. Of course, if you're somebody who prefers to figure things out on your own, or you just enjoy getting lost in the world, you have the option to turn this off. It's a perfect system in my opinion, and it greatly increases the fun I have navigating the world. All of the major areas have something interesting to offer in terms of varied aesthetics. You've got the rainy overgrowth of Talon Overworld, the haunting remains of Chozo Ruins, the molten rock of Magmore Caverns, the calming tundra of Franjana Drifts, and the toxic tunnels in Phazon Mines. It is curious how all of these biomes are in such close proximity to each other on a single planet, but I know I'm just nitpicking. The fact of the matter is that I never feel like my immersion is being broken when I take an elevator to a different area. I've already briefly explained to you the aesthetic of Talon Overworld, but why don't we spend a little more time discussing it? Throughout the first few hours of the game, you won't be spending too much time here. That is, until you acquire the Ice Beam and make your way to the frigate crash site. You'll be exploring a familiar yet foreign set of hallways. The tubes are flooded and overgrown, clearly a sign of destruction. Then you realize where you're at. The space pirate frigate Orpheon from the start of the game. I always thought this section was incredibly smart because it allowed the developers to reuse assets and still create a phenomenal experience. If you're familiar with the development history of Metroid Prime, you'd most likely know that the developers only had around 2 years to create the game, and they would work upwards of 80 to 100 hours a week leading up to the game's release. It takes an absurd amount of creativity to so effectively repurpose something like that and make it even more impactful. So, once again, Major props to Retro Studios. In contrast to the tone of the intro segment, the flooded frigate is scored with an elegant piano piece to accompany your adventure. If you pay close attention throughout your trek through the frigate, you'll more than likely see many familiar sights. And that leads me to one of the chief reasons Metroid Prime's world design is so compelling: attention to detail. For a console mostly occupied by aesthetics adjacent to Wind Waker and Mario Sunshine, Metroid Prime looks astonishingly good. Of course, this is not to say that either one of those games have bad visual designs, as I am quite fond of both. The point is that Prime's visual detail makes it seem like it shouldn't even be possible on the GameCube. The game's art direction still looks incredible to this day. The environments are littered with texture and polish, to the point where it seems like every room was meticulously curated down to each pixel. Metroid Prime makes use of a rugged texturing style that conveys a sense of cartoonish realism in each area. Visual design in games does not require realism to be immersive, but each location is grounded in the Metroid universe, follows a natural sense of progression, and is viewed through a first-person perspective. So all of these factors add up to one of the most detail-rich and immersive games I've ever experienced. If you take a look at the icons for each power beam, you'll see it's represented by a color and a certain hand sign. Once you have the X-ray visor, you can activate it, switch beams, and see Samus's hand moving to match the icon of the beam you selected through her arm cannon. It's a really cool detail that reinforces Samus being a character rather than just a robotic vessel of the player. Another instance of this is after you beat Thardus and a little stone knocks Samus in the head. It's a comedic little moment that conveys a similar idea, which I enjoy. Let's continue discussing the locations though. Next on the path is the Chozo Ruins. This biome mostly ditches the natural wildlife in favor of collapsed structures made of light brown bricks. The Chozo Ruins is one of the biggest areas in the game, and it certainly makes great use of all that space. This area is home to many different puzzle rooms, elevators, upgrades, and enemies. Throughout your time in Chozo Ruins, you'll be listening to a groovy percussion with a whistle melody stacked on it. It does a sensational job at motivating the player to explore the area. Magmoor Caverns is located at the core of Talon 4, and this biome immediately signals to you its oppressive atmosphere upon entrance. Your eyes are assaulted by the presence of bright reds and dark grays clashing together to elicit the sense of dread you'd probably feel inside of a volcano. The cramped cave-like rooms, dangerous enemies, and hallway layout prove to be more of a challenge than anything we've faced thus far. The emotions you feel in this area are best categorized by a single song, the Magmoor Caverns theme. This elevated take on the Norfair theme from Super Metroid further conveys how foreboding this area feels. One of my favorite sections in the game is a section where you must raise platforms by activating a couple of boost switches to raise the ceiling of one of the rooms to unlock a sprawling spider ball obstacle course. I'm glad that this challenge exists, as I feel it's one of the only times in the entire game that the spider ball is given the ability to shine. This is the only time in the game that Magmoor Caverns houses a power-up required for progression, as the region mostly serves as a means to travel to other areas. Phendrana Drifts is the next region you encounter, and entering it for the first time and gawking at its beauty is probably one of my favorite moments in any Metroid game. You're immediately engrossed in this comforting overworld that's easy on the eyes and ears. Throughout every world in the game, the visuals and music work in tandem to establish an atmosphere. Phendrana Drifts is probably the best example in the game, and I don't think there's another game I've ever played that has successfully matched it. I can't marvel at this region's magic any longer though, so we must move on. Phendrana Drifts is also composed of two other major areas within it, the Pirate Lab and the Phendrana Drifts Depths. The Pirate Lab offers a nice aesthetic change of pace, as much as I love the Phendrana overworld. The dark, spooky lab built inside of a snowy mountain vibe was a phenomenal choice. I love the contrast in the emotions you feel from going from the snowy wonderland immediately into the lab. Phendrana's Depths place you in an icy cave with a faster-paced synth theme backing it, which just so happens to be one of my favorite tracks in the game. The final major region of the game is Phazon Mines, where the combat, puzzle solving, and narrative reach its climax. The Phazon Mines is where the space pirates are performing a majority of their research, as both they and their computer stations are plentiful here. The combat becomes the most involved it's ever been up until this point, as you will have far more difficult and numerous enemy encounters around every corner. Phazon Mines utilizes a lot of dark browns and grays, with the outside area appearing to be very hazy, insinuating that the space pirates have heavily polluted the region. The area is divided into 3 different floors, which can be a bit cumbersome to backtrack through, but it makes for a great first run of the region. The track that plays in the first few moments of your arrival will forever cement the creepiness and mystery of what lies in the next rooms in your mind. While poking around in Talon Overworld, you're bound to come across the Chozo Artifact Temple, although some players may not find it until the end of the game. Stumbling into this room for the first time was a whimsical moment, and it still takes my breath away each and every playthrough. Prime smartly adopts some level motifs from Super Metroid, with some unique to this game also thrown in. It's very cool to have 3D adaptations of areas like Norfair and the wrecked ship in the form of Magmor and the crashed frigate. It gives series veterans a bit of fan service while still offering a new experience, and for new players, it's entirely unintrusive. I've heard some criticism of the game feeling like a bit of a retread of Super and modern discussion, but I'm going to have to reject this notion for a few reasons. As Prime is the first 3D adaptation of the series, it makes sense to implement some iconic locations and fully realize them. There was also an 8-year gap between Super and Prime, in which there were no new games, so why wouldn't you take some ideas from the beloved prior entry? The game introduces more than enough new locations like Phazon Mines, Phendrana Drifts, and Chozo Ruins, which just so happen to be the biggest parts of the map. Another interesting facet of the world design is how it teaches you to utilize a newly acquired upgrade. Past 2D Metroids did this as well, but I think the switch to 3D brought some interesting ideas when it comes to teaching the player about their new upgrade. Take the boost ball for example. You're told how to use it and that it can be used to build momentum on half pipes. You're then required to apply that knowledge to leave the room, and that immediately makes you think of any other half pipe structures you may have seen in the world prior. On my first playthrough, I was always extremely curious why there was a perfect half circle in the center of Chozo Plaza. After acquiring the boost ball, it suddenly all made sense. I was extremely eager to see what it could take me to. The spider ball also has a similar process, as after you kill the boss and get the upgrade, you'll understand what those weird golden tracks in the sun tower are for. Understanding how the world implicitly teaches you applications of your upgrades is key to Metroid Prime, and it's why the world design is so much fun to experience. After finding your way to the Chozo ruins for the first time, the hook of the game makes itself known, which is the rush of exploring a deserted planet in search of power-ups to upgrade your suit. These power-ups help you both take on enemies easier and unlock more of the world. This has been the premise of every Metroid game prior, but to accommodate the Z-axis, some major changes had to be made. The most notable one is the shift in perspective. Metroid Prime changes the series from a 2D side-scroller to a first-person adventure. This view allowed Retro to introduce brand new upgrades like the X-ray and thermal visor, but it also contextualizes the scanning system in the game. But perhaps the most important change brought about by the first-person perspective is the ease that the game immerses you in its world with. You're not just controlling Samus, you are Samus. The sheer size of the bosses you fight, for example, make you feel powerless almost. When a Metroid lunges at Samus's head, it completely blocks your vision. Her visor will get staticky when there's an enemy that interferes with its signal. Occasionally, you'll even see Samus's reflection flash on the screen, which freaked me the hell out the first time it happened. So although this game is technically a first-person action/shooter game, combat is not the main focus here. It's about exploring the world. This certainly isn't to say that there wasn't some major work put into updating the combat though. In Super Metroid, your beam upgrades were just that, upgrades. The wave beam let you shoot through walls, and the plasma beam can travel through multiple enemies. That game also lets you customize your beam upgrades and combine them in unique ways. In Metroid Prime, however, the beam functions a bit differently. Now, each beam power is its own dedicated beam. The previous ability of the wave beam makes little sense in a 3D plane, so in Prime, it functions more as a beam of electricity. It can be used to temporarily stun enemies and activate electrical conduits. The plasma beam is essentially a beefier power beam with lava capabilities. It's mostly used as a way to melt ice in the world. The thermal visor is used to identify locations of electric conduits and weak points on particular enemies. It's first unlocked in Phendrana Drifts after making your way through the Space Pirate Lab. After obtaining it, the lights in the lab will shut off and you'll be forced to backtrack through using the visor. This is where I would say the downside of first person in this game is evident. At first, using the thermal visor and seeing the heat radiate off of enemies is immersive, but this section definitely overstays its welcome. I find the bright reds and yellows to be a little too harsh to look at for long periods of time. It's a novel idea for an upgrade that I think has worth. I just wish they could have tackled it a little differently. The X-ray visor, on the other hand, is a hell of a lot cooler. It lets you uncover hidden platforms and fake walls. I find it to be implemented very well, and it's incredibly satisfying to run into a dead end and attempt to use the X-ray visor, and find that to be the solution. Its inclusion creates incredible aha moments that solidify its place as one of the best new power-ups in the game. To further account for the shift to 3D, Retro added a lock-on shooting mechanic to simplify combat and alleviate potential frustrations with the lack of dual analog sticks. Some gaming veterans may hear this and think that all of the skill has been removed, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Since the bullets in this game are projectile rather than hit scan, I think this is a much needed addition. After all, the game isn't supposed to place a focus on FPS style combat. In addition to the shooting and exploring you'll be doing, there are plenty of puzzles around the world. One of my favorites is the spider track puzzle in Phazon Mines. It's not a hard puzzle by any means, but I'm a total sucker for puzzles that you solve over time to progress. You have to line up the specific color tracks with the branching top part to climb up and navigate through different doors. The aforementioned Magmore Cavern Spiderball track is another great one, but I'll spare you me gushing over it for the second time. The fact that all of these puzzles are extremely simple and fast make this game so much easier to boot up for multiple playthroughs. I can beat the game in about 5 to 6 hours now, and that's with getting a whole bunch of upgrades. Many of the energy tanks require short, bite-sized little puzzles that make them a joy to collect. I suppose we should talk about enemies, since that is what you'll be using your upgrades on after all. At the beginning of the game, you're making your way through the habitats of many bizarre alien creatures, and they pose their own threat in addition to what you're here for. You'll encounter large beetles, hummingbird-like wasps, and two-legged icy dinosaur things. Although these enemies aren't anything special in the grand scheme of the game, I think I actually enjoy that. I tend to think of these enemies as minuscule inhabitants of a large, deserted planet. Exploring an unfamiliar, foreboding world is at the core of the Metroid aesthetic. It's nice that the game lets you have this for a few hours. That is, until you make your way into the Space Pirate Lab and encounter your first battle. For the rest of the game, space pirates will be your primary threat when moving from room to room, followed by Metroids. We'll first talk about the space pirates. The space pirates are relatively simple enemies, but the sheer variety of them present help keep the fights fresh. You've got the base pirates that simply run towards you while shooting and periodically swiping their claws. The pirates with the jetpacks grant them more mobility, and upon death will crash into the ground and explode. These enemies make combat have less of a focus on precise aiming and more on swift movement. Had Retro opted for a design approach that made these enemies slow and sensitive to damage, the lock-on feature would make this game a cakewalk. Instead, you engage with the enemies by balancing your damage output with dodges to avoid damage yourself. This concept is beautifully adapted into a 3D space rooting from none other than its 2D predecessors. In boss fights like Kraid and Super Metroid, for example, you'll have to strike a balance between firing shots and dodging Kraid's attacks. The 2D plane simplifies things by not requiring the player to aim precise shots, but it also lacks a strafe feature. Regardless, Retro understood what makes combat in those past games so engaging and evolved it into the enemy encounters. It's hard to talk about the enemies in this game without bringing up the infamous Chozo ghosts. As I'm sure you can infer, they are the spirits of the Chozo found in the Chozo ruins. Upon entering a room they're in, the lights will dim and you'll hear a demonic shriek. What people dislike about these encounters is that the Chozo ghosts will vanish and jump around the room and poke you. To make matters worse, there are typically about 4 of them per encounter, and they each have a pretty big health bar. I think that the Chozo ghosts are some of the best enemy encounters in Metroid Prime. While the space pirates are far from bad, I find the Chozo ghosts to be much more engaging to fight. The fact that you never know where they will pop up next keeps you on your toes and rushing to try to get shots in. You can actually one-hit the Chozo ghosts with a well-timed super missile, which is a huge help in these fights. So if you're not keen on fighting them like I am, you've got a quicker option to kill them. Yes, when I'm backtracking through an area and the Chozo ghosts appear, I will just move to the next room if the doors don't lock. When that's not an option though, I enjoy the encounters. I really like what Retro did with the Metroids in this game. You'll often find them confined in glass pods, assumed to be dead until they screech and break free, prompting a battle. I have to reiterate how cool it is that you can see them sucking the energy out of you from the inside of Samus's visor. There are also moments in the game where you can unleash the Metroids on a couple of unsuspecting space pirates, which never fails to make me laugh to myself. My go-to attack sequence when fighting these guys is to hit them with the ice beam, and then either blast them with the missile or charge beam shot. That's another thing I love about Metroid Prime. Once you gain familiarity with your arsenal, you're rewarded with optimizing your fights by second nature. As the game progresses, you'll actually encounter multiple variants of the Metroids, which are far more difficult. At the very end of the game, you find a way stronger version of the base Metroids that have been corrupted by Phazon, which can be a total bitch to deal with. I typically opt to power bomb them off of me, but you can also try shooting them. It is a shame that you don't encounter these variations of the Metroids before landing in the impact crater, because I think that, if implemented with a little restraint, they could have been a welcome addition for specific areas of the game. Still, the magic of seeing these little bug creatures adapted fully into 3D for the first time never fully wanes on me. The Morph Ball also received a huge overhaul in Prime. In the 2D entries, the ability essentially boiled down to a mobile crouch feature. The new Z-axis combined with the first-person perspective required intense thought from the developers on how exactly the Morph Ball would function. Throughout early development, Retro had planned on making the game third-person, but Miyamoto insisted on first-person, because the combat was clunky and unintuitive. Even after adapting the game to first-person, activating the Morph Ball would still pull the camera out of Samus's visor. This allowed for a ton of unique uses for the ball the series had never seen before. The ball has a certain weight to it that makes navigating through tunnels and slopes a blast. The best way I could put it is that it feels like you're controlling a bowling ball. With the new addition of the boost ball, the Morph Ball is used for exploration and puzzle solving more than ever. Throughout the adventure, you're more than likely going to be traveling through these small Morph Ball puzzle tunnels. The puzzles in these things are never anything mind-blowing, but moving the ball through the tunnels is more fun than it has any right being. Using the boost ball in the designated slots to lower bridges or raise platforms is continuously satisfying upon every single playthrough. My favorite use of the morph ball is boosting back and forth on the walls of half pipes to gain speed and height. It's great that it's used often to reach new power-ups and secret upgrades. The boost ball also makes traveling much quicker, assuming you're not exiting to open doors all too often. All of the changes to the morph ball make this game a joy to play and experiment with, and Metroid Prime would simply not be the same without them. Talon 4 is a planet of many aesthetics and emotions, but there's also a duality of narratives present. The best part about the story in this game is that it can be as lengthy and complex, or quick and simple as you'd like it to be. All of the story details are told through random objects and creatures placed throughout the world. The story is never forced upon you, and you can skip it altogether if you'd like. On your first initial run-through of Chozo Ruins, you have the option of scanning the world around you to learn about the Chozo that inhabited this region. You'll learn about the Chozo population's slow descent into extinction before the meteor inevitably wipes them out, along with corrupting their structures and wildlife inhabitants. Despite Chozo Ruins being the brightest region of the game, it still feels incredibly ominous. There once lived an ancient alien civilization here, and you are left to explore the remnants of their home all these years later. The boss Flagra of the Chozo Ruins was once a sacred plant that had the prestige of residing in the Sun Chamber. However, the catastrophic forces of Phazon reformed it beyond recognition. Throughout the Chozo Ruins, Phendrana Labs, and Phazon Mines, there are walls and computers that the game suggests you do scan, which is denoted by a glowing wall or red square, but you don't have to. The game does encourage you to indulge yourself in its lore, as sometimes necessary scan switches are cheekily placed right next to lore entries, which you may accidentally scan while looking around. While you're in the Phendrana and Phazon Mines labs, you'll learn about everything the space pirates are doing in an attempt to genetically modify Metroids using Phazon to harness their powers for their own biddings. It's quite the frightening prospect if you know what the Metroids are capable of. The space pirates go into grave detail in each of these log entries, and the story only gets deeper as you progress. They were even toying with genetically modifying their own species, which drove many of the test subjects to insanity or death. There's so much to love about the way the narrative is presented in Metroid Prime. The sense of isolation you endure throughout the overall experience is due to the fact that there is no entity presenting the story to you. You are merely reading writing left by characters you'll never see. The fact that you choose to engage with the narrative is great, because even without it, you still get to experience a story, just one with some holes in it. A player who makes a beeline to the end of the game will experience a story of Samus investigating a distress signal, encountering Ridley, chasing him to a nearby planet, and using resources on the planet to power up and take on Ridley at the end of the game. They may be a little confused about the final boss being Metroid Prime, but they would get about as much depth as an average Mario story. The player who takes the time to engage with the lore will learn about the story of the Chozo species' slow path to extinction because of a Phazon-infested meteor that corrupts every facet of Talon 4, and how the space pirates are on the planet to utilize Phazon to create a powerful weapon out of Metroids. You'll learn about their many horrific testing trials, and how the entity Metroid Prime was created, where it all ties up nicely at the very end of the game. There really weren't any compromises made when executing the story in this fashion, and it's something I love about the game. What keeps people coming back to Metroid time and time again is the sensation of getting increasingly powerful and unlocking new intriguing areas to explore. Of course, with Metroid Prime being the first venture into 3D for the series, there were bound to be a few missteps. At the beginning of the game, progression seems to be following a steady rhythm. After finding Chozo Ruins, you go through the only door you can, you unlock the missiles, then go back to the main plaza. Unlock the missile door, grab the morph ball, and go through the ball pipe, etc. Once you get to Phendrana Drifts, you realize you need to grab the space jump to progress further. You head back all the way through Magmore Caverns, into Talon Overworld to grab them. Once you've got them, you go back the exact same way you came in, all the way back to the area of Phendrana you were exploring before. And this isn't the only example of the game having you do this. After getting the ice beam, you're implicitly encouraged to go to Talon Overworld through a new elevator, and wow, what do you know? You're in a room you may have already seen with an ice door right below you. This is the aforementioned flooded frigate, and the game has you go most of the way through it without the gravity suit before making you turn around towards the end to go get it. Once you get the gravity suit, after making your way through Fendrana's own water section, you come all the way back to Talon, but at least this time you unlock a new shortcut elevator. Admittedly, this can be avoided if you know to avoid the underwater frigate and just go straight for the gravity suit, but it's odd that they would even make a first-time player go through all of that. You may have noticed something in common between those two paths I mentioned. The answer is that they both have you travel from Talon Overworld to Fendrana. As you can see on this graph courtesy of the Metroid subreddit, Fendrana Drifts only has 2 elevators, which both connect to Magmoor Caverns, meaning the only way to get to Fendrana is by going through Magmoor Caverns. The issue with this is that Magmoor Caverns is essentially one giant line where you'll have to go through a ton of linear rooms in order to get to your destination. To make matters worse, Talon Overworld only has 1 elevator that connects to Magmoor, and it doesn't even unlock until halfway into the game. So what that means is you'll be relegated to using the lone elevator located in Chozo Ruins. Of course, I'm sure the developers knew traveling through 4 different areas and back just for 1 power-up is far from ideal, but I may have a theory as to why they did this. The 2D Metroid games only had to worry about the X and Y plane, which made your only options for movement right, left, up, and down due to the side angle of the camera. In Prime, all of this is thrown out the window. Samus has full 360-degree movement, which allows for more complex puzzles and platforming design. But the shift in perspective is why there are a lack of areas that use verticality compared to the other games. This is also why the game lacks the screw attack and the speed booster. It just would have been too jarring. Later entries in the sub-series will render that statement incorrect, but I'll get to them one day. After all, we're focusing on the first one here. You can definitely see areas of the game where the devs toyed with more vertical areas, like the Space Pirate Labs in Fendrana. And let me tell you, I'm glad that they ended up taking the approach that they did for the rest of the game. The area itself is fun to explore, but the focus on verticality made it so that there are no quicker and easier ways to backtrack throughout the area later on. You're forced to travel through the entire lab with all of the enemy encounters that entails. So, yes, I'm glad that they ended up going with a more horizontally focused world design for this game, even with the tedious backtracking that comes with it. I'm by no means a game designer, but I still think that more could have been done to mitigate the problem. If there could have been just 1 elevator somewhere in Talon Overworld that you need the boost ball or space jump to access that would bring you to Fendrana Drifts, I would have 0 complaints. The artifact quest is perhaps the most contentious part of the game in modern discussion. I know I just spent like 4 minutes dogging on this game's backtracking, but hear me out. I think that the artifact quest is a good addition. It requires you to go back through areas you're already familiar with and may not have been to in a while and inspect each room closely. Of course, a first-time player may not be aware of the artifact quest until the very end of the game, but I think that's exactly what Retro intended. After all, this game was coming 2 console generations after the most recent entry in the franchise. This would be many players' first Metroid game. They may not have known of the series' heavy emphasis on finding supplemental items like missile expansions and energy tanks, and the fact that these upgrades are barred behind more substantial upgrades in old rooms. So by forcing these players through these locations in search of the artifacts, they will more than likely be finding useful upgrades along their path. Thankfully for returning players, you can start searching for the artifacts as soon as you land on Talon's surface. The problem is that many of the artifacts are locked behind late game upgrades, like the Plasma Beam, Phazon Suit, or Power Bomb. Had they been a little bit more accessible earlier on in the game, there wouldn't be an issue. But alas, that is not the case. What would have been preferable is allowing the player to find 8 artifacts to trigger the endgame boss sequence, and then finding the other 4 would unlock a stronger Power Beam or Suit, just as a cool reward to the more dedicated completionists. This way, everybody wins. Players that are just looking to run through the game don't have to spend a daunting amount of time unlocking the final boss, and completionists get to enjoy a more natural backtracking experience. This would also add variety to your experience on repeat playthroughs, especially if this theoretical weapon worked a bit differently than the rest of your arsenal. In regards to the artifacts themselves, the quests are incredibly solid. I really enjoyed interpreting the clues you'd get from scanning the totems on my first playthrough, and a lot of them are very well hidden. The text blurbs give you just the right amount of details, typically insinuating what room within a given world they're in, and the task you must complete to obtain it. I do think there are some rather lackluster ones. I don't love either of the artifacts in Magmoor Caverns. The artifact of strength is really easy to find. It just kinda seems like the door that contains it would be a pathway forward rather than hiding an elusive artifact. I also would have preferred if they took a different approach with the artifact of nature, because there are a lot of rooms in Magmoor Caverns with stone columns, and it can be kind of boring to slowly make your way through each room and blow them up one by one. I enjoy the variety that the rest of them bring to the MacGuffin hunt. I always hear complaints about the artifact of spirit, with many people thinking that it's too obtuse. I really don't want to come off as mean, but I don't know how you can read Phendrana's Edge and Unseen Entrance and be confused on where to go. Especially because it points you specifically to the top of the room. Sure, there are very few instances where you're required to use the X-ray visor to find a hidden door, but it shouldn't be too hard to make the connection between Unseen Entrance and the X-ray visor. An artifact I did have trouble with, however, was the artifact of Elder. This artifact is found at the control tower in Phendrana Drifts. The clue that you're given is that a tower sits atop the Space Pirate Fortress. Collapse it to reveal the chamber. What you're supposed to do is break the crates blocking a window that's melted shut with ice. Melt the ice away and blast the tower in the distance with a missile. The problem I had was that I didn't even realize you could interact with this tower, since it appeared to just be a texture off in the distance that's there for no reason other than to add to the ambiance of the area. Once I figured it out though, I was honestly kind of wowed. I realized that everything in this world was meticulously placed there for a reason, and you can never underestimate what's possible in Metroid Prime. It gave me a new perspective on the game in the following play sessions, and it's a moment I always think about whenever I'm playing a brand new Metroidvania for the first time. I'll be the first to admit that the bosses in this game are sort of a mixed bag. I'm going to consider every major enemy that bars you from getting a power-up as at least a mini-boss in this section. The very first boss you encounter is the Parasite Queen, which works well to teach you how to effectively lock on and strafe to time shots. It's a short fight that never gets all too complex, which works for this stage of the game. You fight your first mini-boss to get the Morph Ball, the Plated Beetle. It teaches you patience and more strafing. I personally don't see it to be all that necessary, since the Parasite Queen taught virtually the same thing, but it's still not a bad fight. The Hive Mecha and Incinerator Drone, on the other hand, are what people usually have in mind when they say this game is bad bosses. These are the first two bosses you encounter after leaving the Space Frigate, and they make for very easy, boring encounters. It's understandable that these first few bosses are mechanically simple, since after all, we're still working on easing players into the new 3D format. Thankfully, things do get better as we continue. The first major boss you fight is Flagra, who you must stun with your power beam and flip all of the light reflectors away from. After doing so, you must bomb the slot at the end of the tunnel that opens up. The number of reflectors you need to flip continues to increase until you hit 4 and the fight concludes. I still wouldn't say Flagra is a great boss or anything, but it's inoffensive at worst. The Big Sheegoth of Phendrana Drifts bars you from attaining the wave beam. In this encounter, you shoot its mouth with missiles once it stops running and starts to breathe heavily. Once again, the mechanics of this one are nothing mind-blowing, but I do enjoy how the sheer size of this thing intimidates the player throughout. The first great boss in the game, I would argue, is Thardus. He must be 10 times the size of Samus, and his deep growls reinforce how threatening he appears. What I enjoy about this boss is how it feels like you're throwing your entire arsenal at him in the battle. You must first activate your thermal visor to locate his weak points, and begin shooting. Once you've done enough damage, they'll be visible through your normal visor. Continue shooting until it explodes, and repeat. All while you're trying to do this, Thardus will slam the ground and create a swift trail of icicles that freeze you if you get stuck. He also frequently will transform into a giant ball and roll around the arena trying to damage you. To avoid him, you go into Morph Ball and boost away. I will say that I wish he turned into a ball less often, because when he's in this form, you cannot damage him. If Retro could have added another attack that would occasionally substitute it, I think it would make the fight more engaging and cut back on the length of time it takes to fight him, which is something that many people have an issue with. I also wish his attacks could have done more damage to make things a little more challenging. Despite how long the fight is, I never even get close to dying after beating him. It just would have made things a little more fun. The next boss you fight is the Omega Pirate of the Phazon Mines. As the name would suggest, he's a behemoth of a space pirate mutated by Phazon. You've got to shoot at the blue orbs on his limbs while dodging his shockwaves and swipes. I don't find them too hard to dodge personally, but if you aren't careful, he can deal a good amount of damage. After you break all four, you have to switch on your X-ray visor and shoot at him as he's regenerating off the Phazon. Once you learn that the super missile, however, absolutely decimates the Omega Pirate, the fight becomes significantly less daunting. I don't think it breaks the fight though, because the majority of your time spent in the fight is dodging and breaking his orbs. Your window to damage him is comparatively short, so it's nice to have the ability to shorten the fight if you're aware of it. I enjoy the encounter. It's immensely satisfying to blast him through the X-ray visor. After you collect the Chozo artifacts, you unlock the fight against Meta Ridley. The first half of this fight is super annoying because one of his most frequent attacks is flying away from the arena into the distance, where you can't hit him. To make it even worse, every time he starts this attack, he does it twice, one time in each direction. The bombs that he drops when he swoops back down are super easy to avoid, so it just feels like you're wasting your time. Thankfully, after getting him low enough, he will land on the arena and the fight starts getting good. He'll lunge at you, breathe fire at you, and swipe his tail across the ground. I do find the lunge to be hard to dodge at times, but it hardly does any damage, much like the rest of his attacks, making it inconsequential to the fight. Ridley is not a bad encounter, just a little bit tedious due to the first half. But right after beating Ridley, you're rewarded with the fight against Metroid Prime, my favorite boss in the game. This giant spider-like creature is the culmination of all the space pirates' genetic modification experiments. The fight occurs in two different phases. The first phase has you matching your beam fire to the color of Metroid Prime, much like the space pirates in Phazon Mines. While it appears a certain color, its attacks will correspond. For example, when Metroid Prime turns white, it will fire beams of ice and attempt to freeze you in a block of ice. It will periodically charge at you regardless of its color, and you have to dodge it by hiding in the cracks in the ground. Keep pressuring him with damage, and he'll continue to burrow further into the ground until you finally kill him. The essence of Metroid Prime escapes its body, and this begins Phase 2. You'll have to constantly swap visors to find it, and stand in the puddles of Phazon to damage it. What I love about both phases of the fight is that it feels like you're utilizing every skill and mechanic you've acquired throughout the game, and it's far more engaging than Flagra or the She-Goth. I love that we get to see the result of everything we've only heard pieces of information about throughout the course of the game. Prime may house some subpar bosses, but I'd be lying if I said that beating the final boss doesn't leave me immensely satisfied at the end of it all. And now, we've come to the end. Metroid Prime is one hell of a game. That's all there really is to say. When writing these videos, I try my best to talk about the mechanics and design of the game in question, but ultimately, what I find most compelling about games is how it makes me feel. Metroid Prime makes me feel alone, powerless, but also keeps me in awe throughout the whole experience. I'm constantly blown away by the worlds I'm exploring, and that motivates me to scour the area for power-ups. I've played this game a million times, so I know what to expect by now, but I constantly find myself yearning to get just another taste of the unique feeling I get from playing it. It continues to be relentlessly engaging every single playthrough. Moments like landing on Talon 4 for the first time, uncovering the story of the extinct Chozo civilization, walking around Phendrana Drifts, and defeating the final boss are gaming memories that I will certainly carry with me for the rest of my life. Metroid Prime may not be a perfect game, but I have to commend it for launching the Metroid series into 3D and gracefully sticking the landing. The game sees the Metroid series at its state of greatest strength and success, which solidifies its merit to the Prime title. but more importantly, it successfully teaches the player to tap into their inner strength, to brave the terrors of Talon 4, and see the light at the end of the tunnel. If you've made it this far in the video or you're new to my channel, I'd like to thank you for giving this video a chance. I know it can be hard to give unfamiliar content a shot, so I sincerely appreciate your time. I hope I've been able to provide you with a deeper understanding of Metroid Prime, or at the very least adequately express why I feel the way I feel about it. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and liking the video, as it's the best way to support me. I'd love to hear your opinion on anything discussed in the video, or pertaining to the game at large. I hope you'll join me whenever I decide to cover Metroid Prime 2, eventually. My name has been Kohana, and I thank you again for watching.